again! You will never see freedom again!
Let me tell you about the loudest sound I've ever heard. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a scream. It was a single crack of wood. A judge's gavel, coming down on a sound block in a silent courtroom. And in that single, sharp sound, a 14-year-old boy's future ended. You will never see freedom again. Those words, they don't just hit your ears. They land in your chest like a stone, and the weight of them spreads, cold and final, through your veins. You feel it in the suddenly too tight air. You see it in the sterile, unforgiving light of the fluorescent tubes overhead. You smell it in the faint, clean scent of lemon polish on the wooden rails, a smell that will forever, for him, mean the end. This is the moment Julian Thorne understood that his intellect, his arrogance, his perfect, brilliant plan, it had all been a lie, he told himself. This was real. The handcuffs on his wrists, cold and heavy. The uniformed officer's hand on his shoulder, turning him away from the world. He had believed, truly believed, he was untouchable. A masterpiece among clumsy sketches. But every masterpiece can burn. And as the gavel echoed, he could smell the smoke. So how does it happen? How does a 14-year-old boy from a beautiful house on a perfect street find himself here, in this cage of his own making? This isn't a story about a monster who was born. This is a story about a monster who was built, piece by piece, from arrogance and a single, fatal flaw. And it all started with what he thought was the perfect crime. Now, I have a question for you. Where are you, right now, listening to this? In your car? On a walk? What does the sky look like outside your window? Take a second. Really look at it. Feel the space around you. That simple feeling of being present in your own life. That is a feeling Julian Thorne will never, ever have again. If you're ready to understand how he lost it, make sure you don't miss a single moment of this story. Subscribe, and let's go back to the beginning. So, let's go back. Before the gavel. Before the trial. Before the blood. Let's go to Crestmere. Now, picture the perfect suburban street. You know the one. The kind of place where the lawns are a uniform, impossible green, cut so short they look like carpet. Where every house is a variation of beige or gray, and the only sound after 8 p.m. is the whisper of sprinklers. It smells of freshly cut grass and ambition. Quiet, desperate ambition. And in the largest, most tastefully modern house on Willow Creek Lane, lived Julian Thorne. From the outside, Julian was the boy who had everything. 14 years old, with a smile that could disarm a teacher and a mind that could run circles around most adults. He was the state chess champion 2 years running. He could debate classical philosophy and then write a computer program that could simulate it. His parents, successful and perpetually busy, saw him as their greatest achievement. A masterpiece they had produced. But if you could step inside Julian's mind with me, you'd see the truth. You'd feel the constant, low hum of boredom. To Julian, the world was a simple, predictable game, and everyone in it was a pawn moving in painfully obvious patterns. His parents. They were useful pieces, funding his life, but their concerns about stock portfolios and country club gossip were trivial. His peers. They were children, obsessed with social media and fleeting trends, their emotions messy and inconvenient. He'd sit at the dinner table, nodding at the right moments, while inside he was screaming from the sheer monotony of it all. His room was a museum of his accomplishments. Trophies, certificates, all perfectly arranged. But there was no life in it. No messy posters, no discarded clothes. It was a showroom. The only thing that felt real was his chessboard, the pieces frozen in mid-battle, a complex problem he was solving. Life was a series of problems to be solved, and people were the variables. Unpredictable, often illogical, but ultimately manageable. His fatal flaw wasn't something ugly, like a temper. It was something far more dangerous. It was a deep, unshakable belief that he was simply better, more evolved. The rules, the moral, the legal, the social ones, they were for other people. For the pawns. He saw himself as the player of the game, and he was bored of playing on easy mode. He didn't hate people. That would require too much emotion. He was indifferent to them. They were tools, or obstacles, or sometimes, just background noise in the dull movie of his life. And what does a player do when he's bored? He looks for a more challenging game. He starts to wonder what would happen if he pushed one of the pawns off the board. Just to see the reaction. Just to feel something. That hunger for a real challenge. That was the seed. And in the quiet, curated perfection of Crestmere, that seed was about to find some very dark soil. To escape the sterile perfection of his own home, Julian had a sanctuary. It wasn't a treehouse or a secret club. It was an old vine-choked garden shed at the very back of the Thorn property, nestled in the shade of 2 weeping willow trees. This was where he went for his art lessons. And this was where he met Arthur Vance. Now, Arthur was everything Julian's world was not. He was a man in his late 60s, with ink-stained fingers and a wardrobe that seemed to be made entirely of worn-out sweaters. He smelled of turpentine, old books, and pipe tobacco. His voice was a low, gravelly thing, the kind that makes you lean in closer to listen. The shed was his studio, a beautiful chaos. Canvases leaned against every wall, some finished, most not. Brushes stood in jam jars like strange, multicolored flowers. The air was thick with the smell of oil paint and damp wood. This wasn't a curated space. It was a lived-in one, a place where mistakes happened and were painted over, where creativity was a messy, emotional process. And this, of course, is where the trouble began. You see, Arthur was the first person who didn't treat Julian like a prodigy. He didn't care about his chess trophies or his test scores. He looked at Julian's art, technically flawless, precise, cold, and he saw right through it. "Julian," he'd say, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the silence. "You've painted the tree. Every leaf is perfect. But where is the wind? Where is the life? I see no soul here." He would stand behind Julian, not as a critic, but as a guide pointing out a missing truth. Art isn't about control. It's about surrender. It's about letting the mess out. You're building a beautiful, perfect cage, and you're sitting inside it. Julian would just smile, a thin, polite smile. He'd nod. He'd even try to add more emotion, as if it were just another variable to input. A splash of red for passion. A blurry line for movement. But it was a calculation. A performance. He despised Arthur's sentimentality. He saw his talk of soul and surrender as a weakness, an excuse for a lack of discipline. But a small, secret part of him was unnerved. Arthur saw him. Truly saw him. And in that seeing, he posed a threat Julian had never encountered. Arthur wasn't a pawn. He was another player on the board, one who played by a set of rules Julian couldn't quite comprehend. And for a boy who believed he understood everything, that was the most dangerous feeling in the world. The stage was set. The brilliant, empty boy. The wise, perceptive old man. And in that cluttered, fragrant shed, a terrible idea began to take root in Julian's mind. What if he silenced the one voice that truly saw his cage? What would that feel like? The idea didn't come to Julian in a rage. It didn't arrive as a scream or a burst of anger. It bloomed in his mind, quiet and full, like a solution to a complex equation. A problem had presented itself. Arthur Vance saw too much. And Julian, the problem solver, began to design an answer. He called it his masterpiece. It was a Thursday night. The rain had started, a soft, steady patter against his bedroom window. He could hear his parents downstairs, watching some forgettable television show. Their world was so small. His was about to become infinite. He didn't feel nervous. He felt focused, clear. This was the ultimate test of his intellect, a real-world application of all his theories. Could he outthink an entire system? Could he commit the perfect crime? He'd already done the research. He knew about fingerprints, about DNA, about trace evidence. He'd read true crime books and forensic studies not with morbid curiosity, but with the detached interest of a student reviewing a textbook. He assembled his tools not with malice, but with precision. A pair of his father's old gardening gloves, kept in the garage. A heavy, stone paperweight from his father's study. Impersonal, cold, efficient. Slipping out into the rain was easy. The sprinklers had shut off, and the world was swallowed by the sound of falling water. It muffled everything. It washed away everything. He moved through the shadows of Crestmere not like a predator, but like a ghost. The perfect, unseen variable. The shed was dark. He knew Arthur would be inside, probably reading by a single lamp. He watched for a moment through the window, seeing the old man's silhouette. He didn't see a person. He saw the final piece of the equation. He knocked softly. When Arthur opened the door, a look of mild surprise on his face, Julian didn't hesitate. The act itself was swift. A single, calculated motion. The paperweight connected with Arthur's temple. There was a dull, wet sound, lost in the rain. No drama. No struggle. Just a switch being turned off. Arthur fell. And Julian felt nothing. No triumph, no horror. Just a quiet confirmation. Step 1 was complete. Now, the real work began. He put on the gloves. He moved through the shed, not as a killer covering his tracks, but as an artist arranging his composition. He pulled drawers out, he scattered a few canvases, he emptied a box of old silverware that Arthur used for still-life studies. He made it look rushed, amateurish. A desperate addict looking for something to pawn. Then, the piece de resistance. From his pocket, he took a single, cheap, nicotine-stained cigarette lighter. He'd stolen it weeks ago from the pocket of a landscaper who worked a few streets over. A man with a record for petty theft. Julian placed it on the floor, near the door, as if it had fallen from a pocket during the struggle. A perfect, misplaced clue for the police to find. A red herring for the pawns to chase. He stood at the door and surveyed his work. The scene was perfect. It told a story of random, violent chaos. It was a lie, crafted with the utmost truthfulness to the details of a lie. He stepped back into the rain, pulling the door closed. The water washed the mud from his shoes, cleansed the air around him. He slipped back into his house, into his room. His parents never stirred. He placed the paperweight back on his father's desk, exactly as he found it. He disposed of the gloves in the outside trash bin, buried deep under other bags. Then he sat at his desk, in the silence of his perfect room. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Julian Thorne didn't feel bored. He felt a profound, thrilling silence. He had done it. He had changed the world, and no one knew. He had the secret, and he was absolutely certain it would remain his. The discovery was made by the woman who came to clean. A piercing scream tore through the quiet morning, a sound so raw and out of place in Crestmere that it seemed to break the very rules of the neighborhood. From his bedroom window, Julian watched it all unfold. He saw the cleaner stumble out of the shed, phone pressed to her ear. He saw the first police car, its lights painting the manicured lawns in frantic strokes of blue and red. He saw his parents, huddled on the porch in their robes, their faces pale masks of confusion and fear. It was time for his performance. He took a deep breath, and let the character of Julian Thorne, the grieving student, settle over him like a second skin. He walked downstairs, his face a perfect canvas of confused concern. "Mom, Dad, what's going on? What are all those police cars doing at Mr. Vance's?" He allowed his voice to crack just a little. He widened his eyes, injecting just the right amount of innocent shock. When his mother pulled him into a hug, he leaned into it, letting his body tremble slightly. Was it a tremble of grief? Or of suppressed exhilaration? To everyone watching, it was grief. When the officers came to speak to the family, Julian was the picture of helpful cooperation. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded in front of him. He was different, Julian told the officer, his tone thoughtful, respectful. He was a brilliant artist, but he seemed so lonely. He talked about people from his past, sometimes like he was afraid of them. He let that hang in the air, a subtle hint at a darker world Arthur might have been involved in. He described the burglary he had staged. "I was over there 2 days ago," he said, his eyes glistening with manufactured tears. He had this old silver box, said it was from his time in Paris. He seemed really protective of it. It's gone now, isn't it? He was guiding them, painting a picture with his words, using truth as his brush. Yes, the silver box existed, but twisting the narrative to his design. He saw the officers nodding, taking notes. They were following his trail. He was the playwright, and they were his actors. He was flawless. The slight quiver in his lower lip. The way he'd look down, as if overcome, before bravely meeting their eyes again to offer another helpful detail. He was the gifted, sensitive boy, traumatized by the violent death of his mentor. And inside, the arrogant monster was preening. They were so simple, so predictable. They consumed his performance, this feast of lies, and asked for seconds. He had not just committed the perfect crime, he was now starring in the perfect aftermath. Back in his room, the chaos of the investigation continuing outside his window, he looked at his reflection. The boy who had everything had just taken something more, a human life. And he had gotten away with it. He smiled. It was the most real expression he had worn all day. The first detectives were exactly what Julian expected. They moved through the scene with a weary competence, checking boxes. The forced entry? The stolen items? The misplaced lighter? They saw the story he had written for them, and they were reading it aloud, word for word. And then she arrived. Detective Eva Rostova didn't slam her car door. She closed it with a quiet, definitive click. She didn't stride, she moved. She was in her late 40s, with a face that was neither hard nor soft, but observant. Her eyes weren't scanners, they were receivers, taking in every frequency of the scene. She stood at the doorway of the shed for a long time, just looking. She didn't see a burglary. She saw a narrative. She noticed the one book pulled from the shelf. A heavy, leather-bound volume on Renaissance perspective. It was lying open, face down, as if tossed aside. But it was the only book disturbed in a shelf full of clutter. A burglar, frantic, would have swept the whole shelf clean. This was selective. She knelt by the overturned box of silverware. The pieces were scattered, but mostly in one cluster. As if they'd been dumped, not rummaged through. And in the middle of the chaos, a single pristine paintbrush lay perfectly aligned on the edge of a table, untouched. Her partner pointed out the stolen silver box. Eva just nodded. Yeah, I see it. But her attention was on the floor. One section of the wooden plank, near the body, was clean. Too clean. As if something had been carefully placed there, protecting it from the dust and turmoil. This wasn't the work of a chaotic, desperate mind. This was the work of a composer. Someone who understood the theory of a burglary but had never felt the panic of one. This was intelligent, controlled, arrogant. She walked over to the Thorns' house. She observed the family. The parents, genuinely distraught. And the boy, Julian, the prodigy. He was perfect. His grief was a well-rehearsed soliloquy. He was helping the police so much. When she sat down with him, she didn't ask about alibis or enemies. She asked about art. Your teacher, she began, her voice calm, almost conversational. Mr. Vance. He talked about composition, right? About what makes a scene feel authentic. Julian, confident, engaged. Yes. He said truth was in the imbalance. That perfection felt false. Eva nodded slowly, her eyes holding his. Interesting. It's like this crime scene. Someone tried to make it look messy, chaotic. But they arranged it. They composed it. There's a cold balance to it. Don't you think? She saw the flicker in his eyes. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift. A predator noticing another predator in its territory. He quickly agreed, adding another layer of intellectual commentary, trying to pull her into a debate. But the trap was set. She had handed him a rope, and he, believing he was the one in control, had taken it. She left the Thorn house knowing one thing for certain. The ghost in the machine wasn't in the shed. It was in that perfectly clean bedroom, sitting at a chessboard, believing it had just won the game. The game, however, had only just begun. And for the first time, Julian felt a chill, the chill of being truly seen. A few days passed. The crime scene tape came down. The news vans packed up and left Crestmere to its silence. For anyone else, this would have been the time to relax, to believe they were safe. But Julian wasn't anyone else. He could feel a presence, a constant, low-grade pressure, like a change in the weather. Detective Rostova. She hadn't gone away. She called it a follow-up. A casual chat. She came to the house alone, no uniform, no partner. She sat in the Thorns' living room, accepting a cup of coffee she didn't drink. She made small talk with his parents, and then, when they left the room, she turned her calm, unblinking attention to Julian. She didn't interrogate him. She conversed. She talked about the fragility of memory. How the mind can play tricks, especially when traumatized. She said she was just trying to clarify a few small things. She was so reasonable, so understanding. It was all a setup. "Julian," she said, her voice soft. "That book we found. The heavy one on the floor. You mentioned it was about Renaissance art." "It was," Julian said, his tone polite, confident. "Right," Eva nodded, sipping her coffee. "It was found open, near Mr. Vance's feet. The pages were bent. It must have fallen during the struggle. And there it was. The trap, laid out with such casual grace." Julian's mind, that perfect logical engine, processed the information. She was wrong. He had placed the book carefully, face down, but away from the body. It hadn't fallen in any struggle. His creation was being misinterpreted. His arrogance flared. He couldn't let this stand. The composition had to be understood. He leaned forward, just slightly. A teacher correcting a slightly slow student. "Actually, detective," he said, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. "It was over by the bookshelf. And it was closed. I remember seeing it when I came in that day to find him." The moment the words left his mouth, the air in the room changed. It got colder. He felt it. Eva Rostova didn't move. She didn't gasp. She just looked at him. Her eyes held his, and in them, he saw no surprise. Only a quiet, confirmed certainty. "Interesting," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The crime scene photos show it open, near his feet. But you're sure it was closed?" "By the shelf." Julian's blood ran cold. The perfect machine in his mind stuttered, skipped a gear. He had taken the bait. He had corrected her on a detail only the composer of the scene, only the killer, could possibly know. The panic was instant, an electric jolt that he violently suppressed. He backtracked, stammering about being upset, about his memory being fuzzy. But it was too late. The first, hairline fracture had appeared in his flawless armor. Eva stood to leave, her demeanor still pleasant. But her final words were not a question. They were a statement, dropped into the quiet room like a stone. "It's the little things, isn't it, Julian?" she said. "The details no one else is supposed to notice. That's where the truth hides." She left him there, in the silence of the perfect living room. The rain ticked against the window. And for the first time, Julian Thorne felt the walls of his own genius not as a fortress, but as a cage. And someone had just found the key. After that casual chat, the investigation changed. It was like watching a predator switch its hunting strategy. Detective Rostova stopped looking at Julian, and started looking at his shadow. His digital shadow. You see, Julian's arrogance didn't stop at the crime scene. It extended into every part of his life, including his own mind. He believed his thoughts were so complex, so elevated, that they deserved preservation. So, he kept a journal. Not a paper one, of course. That could be found. This was an encrypted digital file, hidden behind layers of passwords and security protocols he designed himself. He called it his cognition log. He never wrote, "I killed Arthur Vance." That would be crude. Instead, he wrote long, philosophical entries about the nature of control. about the purity of an act divorced from emotion. He documented the investigation's progress with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. The primary investigator, Rostova, exhibits above-average pattern recognition, he typed one evening, a faint smile on his face. But she is constrained by her empathy, a predictable flaw. She seeks a motive of passion, unable to conceptualize a motive of pure intellectual exercise. He was writing his own legend, and he was certain no one would ever read it. The journal was his secret audience, a mirror that reflected his genius back at him. It was the ultimate act of narcissism. Meanwhile, in a sterile, brightly lit room at the police station, a different kind of intellect was at work. A young forensic tech named Ben, who drank too much coffee and spoke in code, was unpacking the digital life of Arthur Vance. He was looking for threats, for debts, for any ripple in the old man's quiet world. And he found a ripple. A tiny, almost insignificant one. A log of network activity from Arthur's ancient desktop computer showed a single, brief, encrypted connection from an unknown device on the night he died. It was a ghost signal. It shouldn't have been there. Ben mentioned it to Rostova offhandedly. Probably nothing. A glitch. But Eva, who now trusted nothing, asked, "Can you trace it?" Ben shrugged. The encryption is military-grade. Seriously sophisticated. But the signal is a fingerprint. If I ever find the device that made it, I'll know. The noose was still invisible, but a thread had been found. And then the second blow landed. Came from the physical world. The forensics lab had been processing every fiber, every speck of dust from the shed. And they found something on the stolen cigarette lighter Julian had so carefully planted. Wrapped around the hinge was a single, microscopic fiber. Bright, electric blue. They ran it through the database. It was a synthetic fabric, uncommon. A specific type used in high-end, limited-edition athletic wear. The kind of clothing a wealthy, status-conscious teenager might own. The kind of clothing a landscaper with a record for petty theft absolutely would not. Eva stood in the lab, looking at the magnified image of that blue fiber. It glowed against the gray metal of the lighter. It was a scream of color in his monochrome, staged scene. A mistake. An arrogant, tiny thread that connected his perfect crime directly back to his world. She now had two threads, one digital, one physical. And she knew they were both attached to the same spider. When she showed up at the Thorn house again, her questions were different. They weren't about art or memory. They were about his computer. His hobbies. His recent purchases. She asked, very casually, if he owned any blue track pants or jackets. Julian stood there, his blood turning to ice. He said he didn't remember. But his mind was screaming. The journal. The fiber. They were on two different trails, but they were both heading straight for him. The walls of his digital fortress suddenly felt paper-thin. The ghost in the machine was no longer just a ghost. It was being hunted. Pressure. It doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes, it's a silent, invisible force that bends everything out of shape. For Julian, the world was now made of rubber and glass, warping, threatening to shatter. He could feel their eyes. Detective Rostova's team was no longer discreet. They were at his school, talking to his teachers. They were in his neighborhood, chatting with his neighbors. They were pulling threads, and the entire tapestry of his life was beginning to loosen. His parents had stopped asking, "How are you holding up?" Now, the questions were tighter, more fearful. "Julian, is there something you need to tell us?" The trust in their eyes was being replaced by a dawning, horrific suspicion. The perfect son was starting to look flawed. And in their world, flaw was failure. His digital journal, his cognition log, was no longer a sanctuary. It became a confessional he was terrified to enter. Every time he opened the encrypted file to vent his frustration, he imagined Rostova's tech expert, Ben, lurking in the code, waiting to pounce. His own mind felt like it was being bugged. And then, the most dangerous shift happened. His arrogance, once a shield, began to curdle into recklessness. The panic was a live wire in his chest, and he couldn't just sit there. He had to do something. He had to reassert control. He decided to give them a new suspect. He spent an evening crafting a fake email account. He researched, finding a name from Arthur's past, a former business partner who had a bitter falling out with him years ago. Using details from old newspaper articles, he composed an anonymous tip. It was clever, layered with just enough truth to be believable. He typed, his fingers flying across the keyboard, a desperate artist adding a reckless new stroke to his painting. He was about to hit send when a cold realization washed over him. This was a trap. Not one Rostova had set, but one he was setting for himself. He looked at the email. It was perfect. Too perfect. The language was precise, intellectual, subtly manipulative. It wasn't the rant of a genuine tipster. It was the composition of someone trying to guide a narrative. It was, he realized with a jolt, exactly the kind of thing he would write. He deleted the draft, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had almost handed them the final piece of the puzzle, a demonstration of his manipulative mind, caught in the act. That was the moment the walls truly closed in. It wasn't the police outside. It was the prison of his own intellect. Every escape route he could conceive of was a path that led back to himself. His genius, the thing he valued most, had become his jailer. He was trapped in a labyrinth of his own design, and the Minotaur at the center wasn't a monster, it was his own reflection, waiting for him. So we arrive here, at the center of the machine. The courtroom. For Julian, this was his final stage. The most important performance of his life. He walked in, not in handcuffs, but in a perfectly fitted suit, his posture straight, his face a mask of calm, intelligent dignity. He saw the jury not as his peers, but as an audience to be won over. He saw the judge as a moderator of a debate he was certain he could win. This was just another game, the rules just more complex than chess. The prosecutor was a man who spoke in facts, a dry recitation of events. He laid out the timeline. The murder. The staged burglary. The misplaced lighter with its damning blue fiber. It was a solid case, built brick by brick. But Julian listened and felt a flicker of his old arrogance. Is that all they have? A thread? A guess? He believed he could outthink them all. He would take the stand, he decided. He would be so articulate, so reasonable, that he would dismantle their simple story. He would explain the fiber as a contamination error. He would frame his intellectual curiosity as being twisted into suspicion. He was the prodigy, the victim of a system that couldn't understand him. But then, Detective Eva Rostova took the stand. She didn't look at the jury with pleading eyes. She didn't raise her voice. She spoke in the same calm, conversational tone she'd used in his living room. And she didn't just present facts, she presented a portrait. A portrait of a mind. She described the crime scene not as a burglary, but as a composition. It was a story someone was trying to tell, she said, her gaze sweeping over the jury. A story of chaos, written by someone who craved control. Every misplaced item was placed. Every clue was left. She talked about the first interview. How he'd corrected her on the position of the book. It wasn't a memory, she explained. It was a curator's instinct. He couldn't stand his artwork being misinterpreted. And then, she dropped the phrase that would hang in the air for the rest of the trial. She described the killer as someone with a pathological arrogance, who believed the rules were for other people. She never once looked at Julian as she said it, but every person in the jury box did. Julian kept his mask on, but he could feel it cracking. This wasn't about what he did. It was about who he was. And Eva Rostova was holding up a mirror, forcing everyone to see the arrogant monster he believed was his greatest asset. The prosecutor stood up. Detective, based on your investigation, would you say the perpetrator felt any remorse? Eva Rostova finally turned her head. Her eyes met Julian's across the crowded room. It wasn't a look of hatred. It was a look of pure, clinical understanding. Remorse, she said, her voice clear and firm, requires an acknowledgement of a moral failure. What I observed was the opposite. A chilling intellectual satisfaction. In that moment, Julian's confidence wavered. The game had changed. They weren't playing checkers anymore. They were playing a game he suddenly didn't know the rules to. The stage was his, but the narrative was slipping from his grasp. And waiting in the wings, he knew, was his journal, the unedited truth of his own mind, waiting to be read aloud. They had saved it for last. The prosecution's final witness wasn't a person. It was a mind, printed on paper. Julian's cognition log. Decrypted, printed, and bound. The forensic tech, Ben, explained it in simple terms. How the ghost signal from Arthur's computer led them to Julian's network. How Julian's own arrogance, using a complex but known encryption algorithm, was his undoing. It wasn't a backdoor, it was a lock, and every lock can be picked with enough time and the right tools. Then, the prosecutor stood. He held the printed journal in his hands. He didn't need to shout. The room was already holding its breath. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to read excerpts from the defendant's personal journal. And he began to read. Julian's own words, in that dry, factual tone, were somehow more terrifying than any accusation. Entry, October 12th. The concept of morality is a societal leash for the mediocre. The truly advanced mind operates on a plane beyond such primitive constructs. A juror, a middle-aged woman, shifted in her seat, her face tightening. Entry, October 28th. Observation. The subject, Arthur Vance, continues to operate under the delusion that emotion is a virtue. It is a flaw, a systemic error in human programming. He mistakes my control for emptiness. He does not understand that I am simply clean. Julian's mother let out a small, choked sound, like a wounded bird. She put her hand over her mouth. Her son, her brilliant son, was a stranger speaking in a cold, alien language. Entry, November 5th. The design is complete. The variables are accounted for. The police will look for passion, for rage. They will be searching for a storm in a teacup. They will not comprehend the glacial calm of a logical conclusion. You could feel the temperature in the room drop. This wasn't a confession of a crime. It was a confession of a state of being. It was the arrogant monster, not just admitting what it did, but explaining why it had the right to do it. And then, the prosecutor came to the entry after the murder. Entry, November 9th. The experiment is a success. The composition was executed flawlessly. They moved through the scene like ants, following the pheromone trails I laid for them. It is almost disappointing. To be a god among insects is a lonely existence. But it is still preferable to being an insect. That's when the mask didn't just crack. It shattered. A soft, desperate moan escaped Julian's lips. He wasn't the brilliant playwright anymore. He was a puppet, and his own words were cutting his strings. He could feel the disgust radiating from the jury, the horror from his parents, the grim satisfaction from Rostova. He had written this. This was his truth. His perfect, unassailable intellect had been captured in his own hand, and was now being used as the rope to hang him. The prosecutor placed the journal down on the lectern. The soft thud was louder than the gavel. The state rests. In the ringing silence that followed, there was nothing left of Julian Thorne. No genius. No prodigy. Just the hollow, echoing truth of his own words, hanging in the air for everyone to see. The journal hadn't just been read aloud. It had performed an autopsy on his soul, and found it vacant. After the journal, there was nothing left to say. The defense tried, of course. They spoke of a child's intellect outpacing his emotional maturity, of philosophical musings taken out of context. But the words were thin, transparent. They bounced off the solid, horrifying truth of Julian's own diary. The jury was sent to deliberate. For Julian, time didn't just slow down. It fractured. He sat in a small, windowless room, the air stale and tasting of dust. Each second was a lifetime. His mind, usually a whirlwind of calculations and scenarios, was blank. White noise. The arrogant monster had been publicly dissected, and what was left was just a terrified, hollowed-out boy. He could no longer plan. He could no longer perform. He could only wait. When they were called back into the courtroom, the world had changed. The lights seemed too bright, the colors too sharp. He saw the jury file in. He tried to read their faces, a skill he'd always been so confident in. But they were a wall. A sealed door. He didn't look at his parents. He couldn't. The judge spoke. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" The woman stood. She held a single piece of paper. Her hand was steady, but her voice, when it came, was tight with emotion. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk took the paper and handed it to the judge, who read it with an unreadable face and handed it back. The paper was returned to the foreperson. The air in the room was gone. Everyone was holding their breath. Julian felt his heart beat once, a thick, painful thud in his chest. On the charge of murder in the first degree. The words hung in the air, a cliff edge. "How do you find the defendant, Julian Thorne?" The foreperson took a breath. Her eyes met his for a single, fleeting second. And in that moment, he knew. Guilty. The word was simple, clean, final. It didn't land like a hammer. It was quieter than that, and infinitely worse. It was a key turning in a lock, deep inside him, sealing a door forever. A single sharp gasp came from his mother, then a sob she muffled into her hands. His father made a sound like he'd been punched. But Julian heard nothing. He saw everything in hyperclarity, the grain of the wooden table in front of him, a scuff mark on the floor, but it all felt distant, like he was watching a movie of his own life ending. The confidence, the arrogance, the brilliant, perfect castle he had built himself. It crumbled into dust in that single, silent moment. There was no audience left to perform for. No game left to play. There was only the verdict. The truth. He was guilty. And for the first time, without the shield of his own genius, he believed it. This is it. The final act. The sentencing hearing. The courtroom felt different now. The curiosity was gone. The spectacle was over. What remained was the grim, administrative machinery of justice, grinding to its inevitable conclusion. The air was heavy with the scent of spent tears and old wood. Arthur Vance's sister spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was filled with a grief so profound it seemed to bend the light in the room. She didn't shout at Julian. She talked about her brother's laugh. The way he would get paint on his glasses. The small, quiet life of a man who just wanted to create beauty. She made Arthur real again, for everyone except the one person who had treated him as an abstract concept. Julian didn't look at her. He stared at his own hands, cuffed in front of him. They looked foreign. The hands that had turned a chess piece, held a paintbrush, and swung a paperweight. They were just hands. They weren't the instruments of a god. They were the tools of a boy. A guilty boy. The judge adjusted his glasses. He looked down at Julian, not with anger, but with a weary, final sadness. He spoke about the law. He referenced the Supreme Court rulings, the concept of irreparable corruption. He talked about the unique horror of a crime committed not out of passion, but out of a cold, intellectual exercise. "And it is the finding of this court," the judge said, his voice resonating in the silent room, "that you, Julian Thorne, at the age of 14, exhibited a level of calculation and a detachment from moral humanity that shows a permanent incorrigibility. You are not a child who made a tragic mistake. You are a person who designed a tragedy and called it art." He paused. The entire world seemed to hold its breath. The sentence for the crime of murder in the first degree is, as mandated by law, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He leaned forward, his eyes locking with Julian's. "You will never see freedom again." Those words, the ones we started with. Now, they had their full meaning. They weren't just words anymore. They were a weather forecast for the rest of his life, an eternal, gray winter. They were the blueprint of a cage that would never, ever open. Julian didn't break down. He didn't scream. The arrogant monster was long gone, its illusion shattered. What was left simply collapsed inward. He felt the officer's hand on his arm, turning him. He saw the door at the back of the courtroom, the door that led out of this world and into the next. As he was led towards it, his eyes met Detective Rostova's. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a quiet, profound pity. And in that moment, he understood the last great truth. He had thought this was a game of intellect, that he was the player and the world was his board. But he was wrong. He was never the player. He was just a piece. And his final move was to trap himself. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. The sound of freedom ending isn't a bang. It's a whisper, a lock turning, a breath you can't quite catch. It's the sound of a boy who had everything and lost it all because he believed the rules were for other people. He was wrong, and he will have a lifetime, a long, long lifetime, to think about it.